Just to set the scene for some of the conversation that we'll have up here, I think one of the things that's, coming across loud and clear through the course of today's presentations, every market within every region is at different stages of maturity. What that does is it means there are different business priorities, different enterprise and consumer pressures, different socioeconomic ambitions in each of those different markets. But there are some common threads and themes that run across them. And that's what we'll seek to examine in this upcoming panel conversation, where we look at some of the existing success stories, but also some of the strategies which can drive forward broadband industry development. I'd like to introduce on the stage to join me for the panel my colleagues Sunil, Daniel and Vishesh. Thank you everybody for joining us on stage here today. I think let's start with a round of introductions. If I can just also say for those in the audience, we are going to welcome questions throughout the course of today's discussion. So please do raise your hand and one of my colleagues will bring across a microphone if you have a comment to make or a question to pose to one of our panelists. But maybe in the course of starting those introductions, Daniel, if we start at your end of the row.
My name is Daniel Tang. I'm from Huawei's data communication product line. I look after the technology strategies for data communication network. Because as we all know, people need ultra broadband to deliver high-speed internet. So on top of the physical bandwidth, we also need to deliver next generation internet service, particularly based on IPv6 protocols.
Thank you, Daniel. Vishesh, if I pass to you.
My name is Vishesh Gupta. I'm not as technically evolved as most of my panelists, but I'm from the banking community. So I sort of run the Asia TMT healthcare and consumer sector banking business for SMBC, based out of Singapore. Have been predominantly a TMT banker throughout my career, and what we do is effectively sort of help finance some of the asset classes we've been talking about. And obviously sort of, the finance looks at both the debt and the equity elements of it.
Thanks, Vishesh. And Sunil, for anybody who's joined us since your presentation, do you want to reintroduce yourself?
Thank you. My name is Sunil Pyarlao from OpenServe South Africa. OpenServe is a wholesale open access network services provider, and I'm an executive responsible for the network architecture and modeling. But I'll try and avoid any technical jargon. I'll try and keep it without technical proficiency.
Let's see if we can hold you to that. I think what you'll see here across, of course, is that we've got a range of backgrounds and perspectives. Hopefully that will bring to the panel, from the investment community, vendor and also operator community. I think just to get us started, just to kind of bring to the surface one of the macro trends that we've been discussing across the course of this afternoon, this fact that connectivity is the absolutely critical driving force for the digital economy, and connectivity for all is the ultimate ambition. What does that mean in terms of driving regional development? I wonder if anybody wants to get us started there.
Sure. So I think, the way at least I look at it, and especially I think the world has changed pretty much pre the pandemic and post the pandemic, right? There were a lot of advanced use cases which were under development, sort of autonomous vehicles, connected machines, and so on and so forth. But the way I see this is, the most basic requirements of education, doing your daily jobs, they have to a large extent, or at least to some extent, moved online, right? Any organization that we see, and I know I'm making a very broad generalization, but to a large degree, people are actually spending a lot of time working from home or working remotely. And I think, to me, being connected doesn't just stop there. Your healthcare services, right? This is all sort of the basics and the essentials. Again, we can go into the more futuristic sort of use cases as well. But I think where Asia is, at least the basics being addressed is what probably will drive a lot of the near-term acceleration in demand. And then, things which are a little more evolved will happen, further down the line.
Absolutely. I think COVID certainly made more acute the fact that broadband is part of our critical national infrastructure just for living our daily lives, even without considering the kind of the use cases and applications of the future. When we think about, those increased demands, that's going to put, or is already putting, a lot of pressure on the IP network, which is, a fundamental enabler for our broadband infrastructure. How important is, this concept of IP on everything? Daniel, I wonder if you have a view.
As we discussed earlier, together there are already a lot of people almost live on the internet every day. So I think when we say ultra broadband for everyone,
Yep.
it's also about internet service to everything. But the challenge today is shortage of IP address due to the limitation of IPv4, basically the internet protocol based on version 4.
Yep.
That's why we work together with IETF, the standard organization, to drive the adoption of IPv6-based implementations. Maybe you have seen some very impressive fiber broadband numbers in China, but similarly, even more impressive is the progress of the IPv6 adoption ratio in China has significantly increased from down to less than 10% to more or less 60% at the end of last year. So this is really quite some progress. I think just like government plays a very important role to accelerate adoption of fiber, the adoption of IPv6 also needs a lot of regulation initiative
Yep.
to drive things forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think where we see the government take the lead from a policy perspective, the industry in that territory then gets behind and adopts more quickly the IPv6 protocol.
Yes, and also I think, of course, the government's own IT spending is also very important here. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that might be a topic that we come back to later on in the
Okay.
conversation.
Yes.
If you think about broadband specifically, how do we feel like we're progressing as an industry towards this concept of ubiquitous broadband? We've seen lots of data points in terms of connectivity trends. I mean, Sunil, I'll start with you because you showed that very fascinating map of how far the light spreads across the African continent. If you take a kind of a global view, how do you think we're doing in that progress towards ubiquitous broadband?
Yeah, ubiquitous broadband is an interesting subject, Mark. We have ubiquity. We definitely have ubiquity, but where do we have it? We have it where the telcos can get the highest ARPU, where you can get the best return on investment. So we have ubiquity in metropolitan areas. And as you move out of the metropolitan, I think ubiquity disappears totally. I used the concept of light earlier on to demonstrate omnipresence.
Yep.
And I think it's not just about connectivity, it's access to internet, access to not just fiber, but access to any form of broadband connectivity is non-existent in many rural parts, many suburban parts. Where Daniel and I were talking earlier on as well. He's got some interesting stats across the world where people don't have access to basic connectivity.
Yep.
So talking about ubiquity, yes, it does exist, but it does not exist all over. It exists in metropolitan areas where you have many operators overbuilding each other. And again, totally related to return on investment. And we need to look at other funding models, which I'm sure my colleague from the bank will talk about how we can fund the deployment of not just fiber, but deployment of broadband in general.
Okay, good. So let's kind of expand on that now then. So we've got this degree of ubiquity in metro areas, but that is not something which is necessarily nationwide. How do we go about filling that gap? What needs to happen for us to spread the light?
So I think just from a sort of funding standpoint, right? And I think where there's light, that's where the money goes, or it's vice versa as well. What at least I've seen, and again, I'd sort of look at digital infrastructure as one bucket of infrastructure for telecoms, right? There's been a lot of progress on certain sectors. Towers, for an example, was at a place 15 years ago where we were probably having similar conversations, or 20 years ago, right? Again, data centers, although not exactly related, but it forms part of the network and the computing. Again, there's a lot of work being done there. Now, broadband as a service has existed probably for the longest time. I mean, pretty much as in line with when we had sort of wireless. But what I haven't seen, at least in Asia, is real investment going into the parts which were underserved many years ago. Yes, the bucket has sort of increased, but you'd be surprised, amongst the most developed nations in Asia, there are still pockets where there's no broadband connectivity. It's just the terrain, and it's where the houses are, and the density. I think, again, this is a very difficult question to answer, because there's no sort of magic around it. But ultimately, I think, to me, the biggest thing here is that we've got to start looking at broadband-based returns from a slightly broader angle. It cannot just be, that ARPU that you get from the X subscribers that you get from that part of the world or that part of a specific country. That may not work in areas with low population density and where the affordability is not really there. Yeah. I think it has to be looked at as a combination of what can be achieved from that internet. I recall sort of, Martin pointed out to some of the stats there. To me, the unconnected, we need to see what happens when they're connected and what's the value that can be generated out of it. If it's just about that X number of subscribers on that Y ARPU, in a lot of instances, I think that return may just not work.
Okay. So on top of funding, I think we also can achieve a lot of saving. For example, you have seen that China has a huge penetration in terms of fiber broadband. One way they have smartly managed to achieve that target is combining the infrastructure rollout of motorways together with the fiber rollout. And also because every year there are so many new apartment buildings being sold out in China. So those apartment buildings have fiber to the home already embedded. So that means it does not need telco to do another round of home visit to rewire the home with fiber. So I think this is a very good example. Similarly, how we have advanced IPv6 penetration so significantly. The reason being that when people getting new smartphones every year, especially when we roll out the 5G network, all the new 4G and 5G smartphones have IPv6 enabled, turned on by default. Yep. So people are not even aware of this fact, but secretly they already are an active IPv6 user now. So I think by combining upgrade of different infrastructure together, physical infrastructure or IP infrastructure, it can save a lot of money. Yeah.
Digital infrastructure by design.
Yes, designed with advanced architecture.
Yeah. Okay, very good. If we then kind of just kind of turn our gaze to where connectivity does already exist, and we saw incredible spikes in terms of bandwidth demand during the COVID periods. We haven't gone back to kind of pre-COVID levels of bandwidth demand. Those have remained. Given that changing landscape, what are some of the technology priorities that the industry should be considering in order to kind of keep up with and harness that demand?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, Mark, because the pandemic has taught us a lot of things. It showed us that bandwidth demand can increase. But more importantly, what it taught us is that if you provide the ability to connect, that ability doesn't disappear. So once connected, people stay connected. They want to be connected. So we've seen a big increase in bandwidth demand because of the need to connect. But that demand did not disappear when the pandemic disappeared. So that's the first interesting part. And then you were talking about technology evolution. Vishesh and Danielle both spoke about the efficiencies of fiber network. So you roll out a network and you change the technology. And technology is forever evolving. It's changing really every few years. You see a new technology come out. And if you have a very robust, very efficient fiber network out there, that investment is a sound investment. You just continue upgrading technology. But I think what becomes difficult is that digital divide that I always speak about gets bigger and bigger. Because you're moving from GPON to XGS-PON to 50 gig PON to 100 gig PON on your existing networks. But we need to see that network expand further. We need to see that while building and changing technology, that we also expand our fiber footprint at a similar pace.
Yeah, and again, to Sunil's point, and while we were chatting earlier, I think I was frankly fairly surprised when Sunil mentioned that there are probably around 40 sort of network providers or fixed line network providers in South Africa, and not the entire country, but places where people want to be, dense urban areas. It's not that investments haven't gone in and people aren't people are looking at technology advancements as well, and again, but it's all concentrated in the areas which were already well served. The question is, how does that get well spread across, right? And again, as I said, there's no magic answer to it. Ultimately, if the affordability is not there, or just the density is not there, for lack of a better word, the investment in some of the other parts have to be subsidized by either returns from the more dense areas or governments sort of coming in, stepping in, and sort of looking at the greater good, and probably a combination of the other, and not ancillary but value-added services around it, right? Which ultimately drive returns for the overall sector. The sector, I think, fixed broadband and generally broadband has been looked at as a very siloed sector, right? It's not been connected to, in terms of investments, to what is out there. Subsea has been, right? You see a lot of subsea cable investments by corporations, but you don't see terrestrial fiber linked investments. You don't see partnerships and JVs forming where a big social media enterprise might say, look, I'm gonna take a certain amount of stake in a company and roll out broadband in this part of a certain country where I may just get access to 50 million subscribers, right? And that's just not for them, that's for everybody else as well. But I guess the puzzle cannot be solved by one or two parties. It's a mesh.
And what would need to happen for that model to change in that way that you're describing, do you think?
So I think, again, there could be various ways to sort of slice the pie, but one of the things around this is either it's a government-led model where network is centralized. And again, for South Africa, the 40 lines are already there. You can't do much about that right now. But if you have a couple of lines or 3 or 4 lines in metro areas in a certain country, I think we should avoid making that from 3 to 40, right? That investment can go into rural areas. But the problem with that is if it's a new enterprise, trying to go into that part of a certain country, returns are always a challenge, right? And I've never seen, we've seen sort of use cases come to us, we've seen transactions come to us, but to be frank and honest, it's been difficult to get to fruition, right? I think one of the things is if you either centralize the network, and that network then has to be effectively utilized by all sort of ISPs and providers, and that in the end is also incentivized to go roll out into the rural parts. But again, there is an element of subsidizing here, right? Because you make returns here and they are invested somewhere there, which is somewhat like the USO model in wireless, which had a good impact, I guess. I think the other way to look at this could also be if governments step in and sort of look at the greater good around this. But to me, one of the challenges with that will always be for how much and for how long, right? If you're running a completely rural area-based broadband network, again, the affordability, the uptake, just the pure reach and the dollar return on that investment may not really work. So it has to be linked through something else, which can be then partnerships coming from the ultimate value-added service providers, right? I see these two as sort of broad frameworks. Again, there could be many others.
Great.
Well, my personal take is maybe start with some business or enterprise service first, because these are people who are likely to develop more advanced application on top of fiber broadband, and they are willing to pay more for that. So either for small or medium business, I think this is also a viable approach. So this way we can get, let's say, 2 kind of returns on the fiber broadband. One is the consumer, the residential market, which is difficult in the rural area. But if there are small business or large companies in the rural areas, I think they also need the fiber. So that's why now we're looking at how to enhance the monetization capability of fiber broadband in the enterprise market so that we can offer not just connectivity, but also other value-added service to those customers. This way, telcos can have more revenue back. If you look at the history of the PSTN development, in the early days, it's mainly been adopted first wave by the business companies or other people who need this for work, rather than using it to call your home, call your mom, right?
Yep.
So I think maybe starting with some of the more business-oriented approach can also help to accelerate the return on investment. Yeah.
And Sunil, when we think about making that business case for faster returns on investment from your own personal perspective, would you agree with the points there that Daniel's making?
Yeah, I think Daniel and Vishesh have both raised very interesting points. And Vishesh and I were chatting earlier about how Singtel has done it in Singapore. Now, let's look at South Africa as a unique example where we have up to 40 different fiber network operators. all chasing for the same land grab, all chasing for metros. And I think if there was some form of regulation, like Vishesh has mentioned with the mobile operators in the early 90s, there was the universal services obligation model. And if government can intervene and say, with all of this overbuild, you're having 4 or 5 networks built over each other, chasing the same ARPU in the same region. And therefore, when we talk about ubiquity, we say we have enough connectivity in the metros. Can we not regulate the way we roll out fiber? And one operator roll out in an area and sell a wholesale network and spread that 40 operators. Other parts of the world, like Spain, has 1 or 2 operators. Singtel has 1. Yeah. But there are parts of the world that have up to 4 to 5 network operators. Yep. And globally, I think if we start to pool our resources, we can very, very easily bridge this digital divide that we all talk about. We can very easily get the fiber out to the places and share that cost to deploy fiber, because that is the most expensive part. Your last mile fiber costs you the most.
Yep.
Deploying, your active equipment costs you roughly about $20 to $30 per user. The rest of your $250 to $500 actually is for the fiber rollout, your last mile rollout. So that is the most expensive part. And from a financing perspective, yes, investment's difficult in areas that you're not going to get good ARPU, that you're not going to get good returns on investment. But if you pull your resources and like Vishesh said, start cross-subsidizing,
yes,
you start getting better economies of scale.
And if you think of say, an underserved or an unserved region, right? And if you think of private capital, both debt and equity, people can take a view around, I think that there's enough available, and there's enough sort of research that can be done around the costs involved of rolling out, what the service can be offered at. I think where private capital would probably sort of struggle a little bit is on the question of, so I'm going and funding the number 2 guy and maybe funding the number 3 guy, but what happens when the number 4 and the number 5 and the 6 and the 7 come in, right? Mm-hmm. And who sort of stops that? So that's been a big challenge, and we've seen in some countries on the wireless side as well, and many markets in Asia, huge population bases have gone from 12, 13 wireless operators to 2 or 3 now. And again, you could keep rolling out. If there is some level of regulation around the number of people who can, first of all, the number of people who can do this, right? Pure hard infrastructure. I think then that infrastructure can become financeable for both banks and equity providers, right? Because again, people like certainty in this space. Yeah. Banks more, equity guys less, because they go for the returns. But in the absence of certainty, or at least a semblance of certainty, financing these vehicles becomes very difficult. And hence they have historically been largely financed by existing sort of organizations like telcos, or in some cases governments.
If we just continue on that for a moment then, so certainty is important from your perspective. We've been talking about fiber to the home, IP evolution. These present great opportunities, but obviously they require significant investment. Aside from the certainty characteristic, what are the other market conditions that need to exist to make it attractive for investment?
So I think if I were to just list down 4 or 5 key attributes when sort of, I guess, and again, this is me sort of putting on both the equity and the debt hats.
Sure.
Somebody would look at when a call it a greenfield project comes to them, right? One would be, what is the cost of rolling out there, right? What is the sort of population density, or call it house density? Normally, you would expect there to be 1 sort of broadband line in a house. Maybe in some cases there are 2. So what's the density? What does it mean to roll out a network here? Again, there could be detailed surveys done, and people would have a sense as to if they were offering the service at a certain price, what could be the take-up, right? Yeah. Again, you can be off by a certain amount, but you'll at least get a decent sense on what's my cost, or what's my capex, and what's my revenue potential here. I think beyond that, what you need to see is how the OpEx pans out. Again, there are existing businesses around it, right? That can all be modeled. To me, the trick to the equation is that whole 3 to 40, right? I launch today, I fund something today, 2 other people come in, slash prices by 30%, my sort of ARPU assumption on a certain amount of bandwidth, there's a toss up to the air, right? I mean, there's nothing behind them. So to me, when these projects come to the market, to the extent there is contracted visibility, that'll be good. If governments can back these up, and again, that's not equity backing, right? that's basically saying we believe in this part of our country, you'll get these many subscribers. It could be in the form of PPP, and again, I saw a mention of that. Or it could be certain level of market risk. Now, equity guys are more prone to taking market risk than banks. But for the right business model, there have been deals done with market risk as well. Right structures, right sort of bells and whistles around it.
Great. And sorry, Sunil.
Go for it. I just want to say that Daniel also raised a very important point about enterprise connectivity.
Yeah.
So, most of these towns, these smaller towns, have business presence. And the business case can actually come from providing connectivity to these enterprises. Because like he rightfully mentioned, enterprise connectivity brings you higher revenues for the very same infrastructure that you rolled out. And Daniel, I don't know if you want to expand on that, but that actually gives you an opportunity. First, gives you firstly the business case to roll out the infrastructure, and secondly, provides you with the opportunity to connect the surrounding community.
Yeah, I think we can take a more holistic approach looking at investment to serve both residential market, even back of the mobile base stations and those business customers. Maybe you can only invest for one set of network infrastructure to serve 3 markets together. Then all you need to do is on-demandly connect each and every home who take up to the fiber broadband, right? So I think there's huge space for us to use this kind of synergy between different business to save a lot of extra cost.
Absolutely. And Daniel, you mentioned earlier about that then creates the opportunity for value-added services. If we think about the services, applications, devices of the future that are going to drive the kind of demand which is going to stimulate investment, what's the panel's sense of what those services, applications, devices might be?
Well, I think there are a lot of potentials. But as we debated together with Vinesh at lunch, that telcos are not the most capable of delivering those very fancy applications. However, it does have a fundamental advantage is everyone will need the connectivity. So what they can do is, first, on top of the basic connectivity service, they can upsell other applications. Yeah. Either the homegrown telco-developed applications, like in Africa, for example, the mobile payment is very successful. So it's a homegrown payment service offered by telcos, right? So you could do the same for the fixed broadband. But at the same time, I believe telco can also upsell as a channel those value-added service. Maybe some kind of innovation from metaverse, from Facebook, from other companies. Not just for the residential applications, but also for the business applications. I know quite a number of big telco operators. They serve as what they call a cloud service broker for Azure from Microsoft or Amazon Web Service from Amazon. Yeah. So this way, I think it can have more diversified offerings and therefore have more, let's say, revenue streams coming back for basic connectivity, for homegrown telco applications, and also as a broker distribution channel fee for those other applications. Yeah.
I think from my standpoint, and I look at this a little more simplistically, and again, completely sort of agree with the points made by Daniel. But if we look at the near term, right, again, just with COVID, households saw and the world saw the number of broadband users drastically increase. That fixed line Wi-Fi that was running around in your house was largely not used by children, right? Kids didn't have access to it. Now they all have a device because they need to take their lessons. They have an iPad or they have a laptop, and again they use simple services there. They would go to sort of the school's website or whatever mediums they use. But beyond that, I think just with the simpler applications of today, which is social networking, online video, your Netflixes of the world, and so on and so forth, I think the amount of bandwidth that requires now, to me, that's an opportunity itself. There are again a lot more advanced use cases which will certainly happen. Autonomous vehicles. It'll take some time for people to trust that, right? I'm not sure if you were told today that going out there'll be 3 sort of autonomous vehicles driving out. I'm not sure how many people will take the train from here. That's to be seen. So to me, connected devices, autonomous vehicles, these are all good long-term use cases. But the fact of the matter is when COVID hit, and people were locked down, there was shortage of devices, networks were down, there was pressure on networks, and that demand has not gone back. Somehow magically people are still consuming that amount of data. Right? So to me, that near-term solution is very important. And it's not just entertainment now. It's your livelihood. It's education. It's healthcare, right?
Maybe just to add to the perception of demand, Mark, there's the perception that demand's exceeding supply. But let's look at the world average of connectivity. You're sitting at about 30 to 35% connectivity with any fiber network operator. OpenServe's among the highest in the world with 46%, which tells me that we got about 60 to 70% of our network unconnected.
Yep.
In other words, supply exceeds demand. But to Vishesh's point, the demand is there, but the demand is not where we have the supply. And that's the big difference. Where we have the supply, where we've passed the homes, we have an excess of supply. The demand is actually where we haven't gone. And that's a balance we need to try to get. So the perception that there's more demand than supply, the demand is not in the metro areas. The metro areas are oversaturated. We've passed more homes there than we can actually connect. And that's just to put the whole demand-supply conversation into perspective.
So it goes back to that ubiquity
Yeah.
point earlier on. It's about making sure that we map ubiquity of supply with ubiquity of demand.
100%. Perfect.
Just to try and bring a few of the threads together in kind of just the last 9 minutes or so here. We've heard across the course of the last few days quite rightly about the importance and the focus on performance. But how as an industry do you think we are doing in terms of delivering on our sustainability and affordability goals?
I'll probably touch upon the affordability part first. And again, that's it's slightly ironic where these services can be appropriately charged for, versus where you need to go. The problem is you need, just given how the investment returns would work out, you need to charge a lot higher in less dense areas, right? It's simple math,
Yeah.
and that's where it just kills the affordability. In dense urban areas, you can probably relatively charge a little less, but that's where people can afford it and pay for it, right? So to me, in terms of affordability, again, certain countries in Asia, again, I have a slide on that, probably not exactly affordability, but talks about ARPUs. I think again, there's probably a wider spread, and it's a function of how many alternatives you have, what's the market dynamic and structure like. And sort of Tsuka-san was also referring to it in her presentation that most nations are actually below that 2% mark with sort of, that deteriorating a little bit. But to me, I think, how do we look at affordability, right? Affordability, if you raise prices by, I was just looking at my phone, and the price for one of my subscription services has been increased by 10%. They just told me, right, that this is going to go up. If you want to cancel, you can cancel. But how do we look at affordability? To me, the real metric that should be looked at is how can this be provided in areas where people will struggle to sort of, pay $20 a month for broadband, right? And how does that gel with where you're providing the service now?
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Thank you,
So,
Daniel.
For us, it's all about how to use technology innovations to structurally reduce the total cost of ownership for the telcos. So total cost of ownership, you can split into two parts. One is CapEx, one is OpEx. On the CapEx part, we do see great opportunities to find synergies between the to-B business, to-C business, and to-home business. So today, we're more or less like, for every village, we're building 3 motorways in parallel, right? One for business, one for homes, one for the radio towers for 5G. But why not combine that into one road, slightly wider, but with lanes very clearly marked, and maybe even bus lanes, dedicated for the business customers or for the mobile backhaul. So this way, I think we can save a lot of both CapEx and OpEx. Now, the other thing about OpEx, by the way, the technology we talked about earlier is called slicing. People know about 5G slicing, but similarly in IP network and optical network, you can also do slicing.
Yep.
Now, the other thing is about reducing the OpEx. As the network grows bigger and bigger, we can no longer afford to have human-based operation model. It's like imagine you have a traffic police standing at every red light or every crossroad, right? Direct traffic. It's not possible. So that's why we're having this new approach. We call it autonomous network, where you can have really using what we call the data-driven autonomous network operation, leveraging advanced big data analytics and AI-based forecast of the traffic. So this way we can basically rely on the algorithms instead of human labors to manage the network, to direct the traffic. And also because this way we can also do what we say increasing the level of visibility of energy consumption. So in the long term, it's also going to make the network more sustainable, less carbon footprint.
And if we build on that final comment there, Daniel, and we think about not just the sustainability of the telco, but what broadband can enable from a sustainability in wider society, I wonder, any thoughts, comments from OpenServe, Sunil?
Yeah, so just before I go there, I want to add on to what Daniel has said. He's made a very good point, and I like the analogy that he used of several highways leading to a small town. There's this mistrust in PON network. There's the mistrust from backhaul consumers that a shared network is not a secure network. And I think we need to understand that the security is actually built in your active equipment, not in your shared network. And the more we start selling that concept that a shared network is still a very secure network. I mean, we've got parts of the world using the shared network for their banking facilities, which is probably one of the most secure facilities. So piggybacking on that statement, Daniel, you can get a lot of efficiencies from, you spoke about slicing, but before we go to slicing, just on the aggregation level, we're still seeing Metro Ethernet aggregation devices being used. So point-to-point connection. Again, one highway for every connection. You can share that with a passive network. Just put on a splitter and you can provide 5 or 6 operators service from the one fiber. So I think there's a lot of efficiencies we can get. It's just a mindset shift that we need to move. We need to move from the all copper-based mindset to a fiber-based mindset, that a fiber can give you different lambdas of light, and you can split that lambda of light, and each lambda is actually a secure lambda. And I think educating the industry on that, educating the consumers on that is important.
Yeah, totally agree.
I think there's a lot of mindset shifting and education required across all of the points that we've been discussing here today. And that's one of the kind of the primary goals of the World Broadband Association as a group. Unless there are any questions or comments from the audience, we have one here. Martin.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, excellent, really interesting panel discussion. I found it very, very insightful. Just on because one of the topics I'm really interested in is innovative rationales for how we fund the different parts of the rollout of next generation broadband. And maybe 2 comments, and maybe people could suggest on them. One is about regulation, right? Since I've been in the industry since the mid-80s, and one of the golden mantras of regulation has been more competition is better for the consumer. And so, most countries started off with 1 supplier, and then, 2 is better than 1, gives you choice, and 3 is better than 2, it gives you choice, and so on. But what I'm hearing from the panel is that thinking only goes so far, and it is broken particularly around the whole concept of bearing the cost of rolling out next generation broadband. And so that's a very serious discussion to be had with regulators. And it's not just from this panel, I've heard it from many other conversations, that we need to have a serious look at when is too much competition starting to be negative for the consumer. The second point is about government role in this and government funding. And ultimately, countries do go down the road of government funding, of maybe a shared broadband network with them, maybe the last mile funded commercially and so on. Nothing is perfect that's out there. But one of the things I'm really interested in, if we really believe in the argument that rolling out broadband, rolling out fibre into these lesser served communities where it's hard to make a business case, if we really believe that argument, that does grow GDP, is there merit in exploring with governments a model where there's almost like a back-ended subvention based on, as the GDP does grow, as the wealth in those areas does grow, there is a government funding back to the operators. So maybe the operators and their financial partners are funding it front-ended, but then in these public-private partnerships over a 20-year, 30-year basis, start getting a claw back from the government based on growth of GDP or growth of wealth in those particular regions. And that might be a more palatable and also create a positive feedback loop in terms of wanting to see the growth from those areas. So those are just two comments, but really excellent panel.
Thank you, Martin. I mean, on that kind of PPP model,
No, just, I mean, and Martin, frankly, excellent comments. I think on the first part, right, that's been the case for most things that we see. Now, again, there are ways to slice that as well. To Daniel's point, there's the CapEx piece and there's the OpEx piece as well. The CapEx piece is basically laying down the fiber, right? I mean, from ground up in most of these places, there's practically not much today. Now, as long as that it can be sort of, I guess, centralized, and people are not effectively looking at one now and sort of 40, I keep coming back to that, 10 years from now, there can at least be certain level of certainty there. Now, beyond that, how you sell that capacity, that is where you can have competition, because that's where service quality matters. The number of people doing it matters. But a big piece of the investment, a big piece of the cost is actually that hard infrastructure. And that can be relatively easier financed if there was certainty, at least around the first part, right? That, this is being done today, and there'll be a lot of people trying to sell from this, but not too many trying to build parallel pipes. So that's I mean, you can still have healthy competition at the ultimate delivery and not at the start.
I think right now we are in a big cycle where huge investment into fiber infrastructure is needed. So I totally agree with Martin's word that we do need a investment-friendly regulation environment here.
I mean, one of the things to probably refer to is a satellite PPP that recently happened in Indonesia. It's the end use is for a lot of government enterprises, but again, I'm sure in all these parts, and whichever government we are looking at, that could be a pocket of use. And if that can be in a way contracted at the start, which leads somewhat of a starting base, right, an anchor to the project. On top of that is the commercial layer. Sorry.
Just a closing remark on that. Martin's stimulated a conversation that we can talk about the entire afternoon.
Yes.
But the balance between when is too much of competition detrimental to the market. So South Africa was one of the most expensive places for broadband in the past, and that price of broadband has dropped significantly due to competition. But what we must be careful is that you don't want too much of competition that it drives the cost of broadband down so much that the focus on land grab is only in certain areas.
Yes.
That everyone's chasing high ARPU and not chasing investment in other areas because the cost to provide service has been really driven down by too much competition. So absolutely agree with both Vishesh, Daniel, and with Martin that competition is healthy. It helps to drop the price down, but you need to get a balance between where too much of competition is going to avoid investment in certain pockets of the market. Thank you, Mark.
Finding that balance will help us to kind of spread the light, going back to your presentation.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope you just join me in thanking our three panelists for this fantastic conversation, Daniel, Vishesh, and Sunil.